He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Hi, I'm Paul Roy, and just a word of warning. This series contains graphic descriptions of rescues and fatalities, as well as some spicy language. Although at times confronting, they are the unfiltered reality of the work of land search and rescue volunteers and those that have been rescued. So if unsettling personal stories affect you, a strong cup of tea might be in order. It's a beautiful sunny day, and I've just driven into Arthur's Pass settlement, which is buzzing with tourists. Around me, the mountains are lightly covered in snow, including Mount Rolleston, the setting for this story of bravery and loss. It established a grim benchmark for search and rescue operations in New Zealand.
We climbed to the low peak and it was absolutely shocking conditions.
We had to carry up all this heavy stuff, huge reels of wire and tripods and anchors and all that kind of stuff. Bloody useless.
9:15, there was a whoosh and I sat up and touched my head on solid. I said, we've been avalanched, Pete. I said, yeah.
Episode 2. A sense of duty. I am making my way to the house of John Charles, a long-time resident and park ranger here.
I started work in August 1959. That applied for a job here and came to Arthur's Pass as just a casual park worker when I was 17, and then got made a trainee ranger and spent the next 28 years at Arthur's Pass.
John probably knows more about Arthur's Pass than most, and his search and rescue experiences go back decades and give a good insight into the can-do attitude of the 60s and why what was about to take place was so unusual. What was the scene like here in Arthur's Pass for sort of climbers and trampers that you saw and that you sort of had to deal with, the type of people that were coming through in those days?
I mean, there's a lot more than what there is now. Not overseas people, just Christchurch guys, It's a CMC hut.
The CMC is the Canterbury Mountaineering Club.
It was popular because you could come up by train, you see, and not everybody had their own cars. Friday night rail car would pull into the station and you could guarantee like 10 minutes later the light would come on up in the CMC hut. Some of them would elect to go and climb Mount Rolleston, some would go Avalanche Peak, some of them would go up Cons Track and do the traverse round into Temple Basin,
With so much outdoors activity, accidents were a dime a dozen.
Well, virtually just about every second weekend we were out looking for someone. I mean, just have to look at the statistics.
John has a sheaf of paper spread out on the table, showing search and rescue incidents over the years. I looked over the annual reports with him.
31st of March 1974, as it say there, 63 incidents, some of them fatal.
So that's a lot in a small place like this, isn't it? I mean, it was an active place, obviously, but and it's got here recovery of remains from accident the previous year. It's a bit unfortunate. And then there's overdue tramping, overdue hunters, overdue tramping, possible accident, river accident, fatal climbing, 2 deaths, overdue accident, climbing frostbite, tramping frostbite. And it goes right down for the 63. And in that year alone, there is three climbing fatalities.
Yep. All the searches were just done locally in those days. There was no outsiders came in to give you a hand or anything. It was the rangers, the policemen from Otira and the railway boys at Otira and Arthur's Pass. So everybody knew each other pretty well because you drank at the Otira pub and there was darts nights and whatnot. So it was like a great big family.
In the event of a search and rescue, there was a set routine.
The first thing I did was I got on the Park Land Rover and went round these club huts. You'd go round the huts and, go up the CMC. got to carry out, anybody give us a hand? And someone say, oh yeah, it won't matter if I miss work tomorrow. So you'd end up with, maybe you could muster probably about 20 or 30 people between Otira and Arthur's Pass.
Before helicopters, rescues were done the old-fashioned way.
Everybody had to be carried out in stretchers, so there was some long stretcher carries in those days. One joker stuck an ice axe through his bloody leg or something up at Waimak Falls Hut. By the time someone came out and said, there's someone up there that the group he was with had already started to carry him, and so we had to muster the boys here and go up the Waimak, and then carry him out. I remember once in the Waimak, this joker with a broken leg. All we did was just splint one leg to the other and got him in that bloody stretcher and just virtually said, well, you just have to put up with the bloody pain and carry out. I mean, you didn't get back here till 5 o'clock at night. I mean, it took all day to...
Sometimes the local police officer was meant to go along too, on any serious rescue.
We used to cringe when they said, oh, we're going to put a cop with your party. I remember once the search we were told, you've got to take this cop with you see. And everybody's going, Jesus Christ, do we have to take him? Yes, you've got to take him. And we did the first river crossing. This joker was completely and utterly out of his bloody depth, By the time we got to the Edwards Hut, he was actually almost bloody crying. And he was down on all fours. I can't go on, I can't go on. And I'm thinking, oh, for God's sake, what are we going to do with this guy? It's a shocker. We said, look, you stop, and we left him at the bloody hut and carried on. I'm not being nasty, but it was just like, yeah, they weren't up to it.
In the absence of any doctor or medical facilities at Arthur's Pass, first aid care was pretty rough and ready.
There was the problem when you got them back to here. I mean, what'd you actually do with them? In fact, I quite often laugh because, I mean, one of the things we used to deal with quite often was broken legs at Temple Basin, right?
Temple Basin was one of the early ski fields.
There was no ambulance or anything in those days. And there's no hospital or anything here. So, I mean, this guy was suddenly your responsibility. So to get them to Christchurch, we used to put them on the rail car at night, So sometimes you'd have someone with a broken leg or something lying on the park headquarters floor up here, saying you'll be right.
But the train didn't come through until later in the evening.
You'd go and see the station master at Arthur's Pass. He'd ring up Greymouth and say, oh, we've got a stretcher tonight, so can you make sure the suitcase is a clear place in the luggage compartment to slide this bloody joker in, And then when it was 5 o'clock and it was time to close the park headquarters down for the night, if you were the duty ranger, it suddenly became your responsibility to look after this guy. So I used to take him back up to our place. Our kids, they still talk about the men that used to lie on the floor in the bloody kitchen, They all survived and no one seemed to worry. Whereas now, of course, I mean, you only have to run out of water on bloody Avalanche Creek and ring up on your cell phone and picks them up and takes them straight back to Christchurch.
In time, attempts were made to provide the park rangers with medical training, with mixed results.
You'd get a letter to say it's your turn to go to this first aid course at Burnham, and you were there for the whole bloody week. They'd give you these lectures, and some first aid army joker would come in with a Schrager stick and say, tap, 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 right, name the 16 bones on the hand, Like when you came out, you almost thought you'd qualified as a bloody brain surgeon, I mean, you're prepared to do anything. To tell the truth, I found it a bit too much. Before that, it was just like, stop the bleeding, put a bandage on someone. I remember some joker got clobbered on Mount Rolleston and came in and had a big cut in his head, and said, could you fix this? And I remember I pulled up the bandage and it sort of went glop, I thought, Jesus. And I put the pad back on again and said, no, you best go to bloody hospital, mate. I mean, this is beyond me.
Search and rescue in Arthur's Pass in the 60s was effective, but fairly laid back. This then was the state of affairs on the long weekend of the 18th of June, 1966. John Charles, now with 5 years' experience at Arthur's Pass and a Grade 2 ranger with a lot of search and rescue experience, recalls the first alarms being raised for 4 men 2 English, 2 Kiwi, who had set off on Saturday to climb the Otira face of Mount Rolleston, a serious climb in those days.
What sort of place is Mount Rolleston? Why does it attract so many people?
Well, I think it attracts people because it's so close proximity to the village, right? And being the second highest peak in Arthur's Pass National Park, and easy of access. I mean, you can climb it in a day, and to climb 7,500 feet. I mean, most of these other mountains around the place, you've got to pack in and stop in a hut for the night to get to do the mountain. Whereas this one here, you can park your car at Otira Valley track at 6 o'clock in the morning, go up and climb Mount Rolleston and come back out in the afternoon. Those guys had come up from Christchurch, and the 2 New Zealand boys were going to take the English boys up Mount Rolleston and back out again on the Monday. On the Tuesday morning, we got a ring here to say that had anybody seen these guys, because the parents rang up and said they didn't come home. I remember on the Tuesday morning we went up the top of the pass, and sure enough their car was parked at the Otira Valley car park, and there was no sign of them at all.
It is only about 2 hours up the Otira Valley from the car park, in good weather, to the base of the Otira face of Rolleston.
We came back here, and then the Chief Ranger decided, well, we should go up the Otira Valley and see if there's any sign of them coming back down the Otira Valley, thinking they might have just got benighted on Rolleston, we're late coming out. And so if we walked up the Otira Valley, we might be able to see them or catch them walking back out the track.
So now the 4 climbers had been overdue for 24 hours.
3 of us went up the Otira Valley on Tuesday afternoon. I took my rifle. We got up to the head of the valley, and the bloody fog came, and you couldn't see a thing. Like, it was just a bloody whiteout. So we decided it was pointless going up the valley further to look up the face, because the whole thing was just shrouded in bloody fog. About 30 minutes short of the face, we were in the creek bed. We're shouting out QE, blah, 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 listening. And I fired 3 shots, boom, 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 just in case, we could get a reply, and we listened, nothing. So we came back out. That was Tuesday afternoon. And so the Chief Ranger, Peter Croft, decided that, well, we better go round the back of Mount Rolleston and see if they've dropped off over in bloody Carrington or the Rolleston River and came down the back way. So in the meantime, he rang up the Otira cop, and the cop at Otira got the railway boys, a party of 4 of the fit guys from Otira. Plan was they went up the Rolleston River over Waimak Coal. We went up the Waimak, up as far as Waimak Falls Hut, and to see if there's any sign of them at Carrington, Waimak Falls, or whether or not they'd dropped over.
The plan now was to check any huts where the missing party may have taken shelter, and involved a sort of pincer movement around Mount Rolleston. One route involved crossing an alpine pass, the other a slog up the 19 kilometres Waimakariri River.
So I remember we set off from here, and it was just, the wind was starting to blow and whatnot. There was 4 of us from here set off with overnight gear up the Waimak. The wind, the snow and the bloody blizzard came in. It was just bloody unbelievable. And it was real blowing down the Waimak, and like it was coming straight towards you, and you know how the snow sticks to a bloody swan dry, and we kept shaking the skirt of the bloody swan dry to get the bloody snow off. So we got to Carrington. The weather was really bloody vicious by this time. It was bloody blowing stink. So we dropped some gear at Carrington Hut and set off to meet the Otira boys. Well, the boys from Otira had a prick of a crossing. Waimak Coal's 5,000 bloody feet, and of course they got this bloody snowstorm up there. They were frozen bloody solid. I really felt sorry for the buggers. We all retreated to Carrington for the night and got the bloody fire going, got bloody dried out and whatnot.
Neither rescue party had a radio, but John had arranged an ingenious way of receiving a message from the park headquarters.
I'd said to the Chief Ranger, look, if you want us to come back out again, we didn't have any radios, but I'd recently come back from overseas and I had a transistor radio. You know what transistor radios are like. People used to kill to get a bloody transistor radio. And I said, if it's any urgent message, See if you can get a bloody message across 3ZB in Christchurch at 7 o'clock.
Welcome back to 3ZB.
You betcha, Murray. It's good to be
And
back
then
in
we
the
can
old
get a
stomping
bloody
ground
message as
again.
to what we should do. We were in Carrington Hut and I remember I threw a bit of wire out the bloody window, tune this thing in 3ZB. And they did the news and then they said, here's a special message for those searchers in the Carrington Hut area of Arthur's Pass National Park. You are to return to Arthur's Pass tomorrow morning. That was very amazing. We didn't get out till probably, bloody 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon of Wednesday, right? And so when we got back here, they'd already got the people to come up from Christchurch.
Wednesday was now the 5th day after the young men had set off for their climb of Rolleston's Otira face, and the last 2 had been blizzard conditions. It was obvious something was wrong, and there was a strong possibility of an accident. By the time Ranger John Charles and his group had returned from their unsuccessful search for the climbers on the far side of Mount Rolleston, the rescue effort had already been escalated.
Word went round the Christchurch climbing community that people were in trouble on Rolleston. They just phoned around the various club members. Are you free? We need help up here.
This is John Wilson, an historian, author, and at the time a search and rescue mountaineer based in Christchurch, who found himself right at the heart of the action. And you'll hear a lot more from him later.
The police rang and said, hey, we want you to get ready. We're go up Arthur's Pass at some ungodly hour of Tuesday morning because of the 4 missing climbers on the Otira face.
Ian Gardner, also a search and rescue volunteer and a key radio communications expert.
So we had to get our gear and Peter and I went up there.
Peter is Peter Squires, Ian's colleague at work and fellow climber. They drove up to Arthur's Pass late on Monday night and were sent out first thing in the morning to look for the missing climbers, as Ian recalls.
The Otira face is a rock climb which gets you to the top of the mountain between the middle peak and the high peak of Mount Rolleston. And it's sought after as probably one of the more difficult climbs on Rolleston. It's probably by today's standards is relatively easy, but it involves having protection, roping up and so forth. We were assigned to go up Mount Philistine, which is adjacent mountain, and there's a ridge that goes between the high peak and Philistine, and the task was to search the ridge. The conditions on the Tuesday were terrible. They were like blizzard conditions. And we got to the top of Philistine and said, it's just not worth us going on along the ridge. Let's get back down. The Wednesday, again, an early start, they said, we want you to go up to the low peak. And we climbed to the low peak, and it was absolutely shocking conditions. Like, you couldn't see more than a few metres. And Peter Farrell said, let's get out of here.
With appalling weather and snow falling heavily, there were now grave fears for the missing climbers.
We went up there, got under the Crow Face, and you can either go at the glacier there or right beside it.
Peter Squires walked into the foot of the Otira face with other rescuers.
I decided to go up the rock ridge, and I got to a higher point earlier than the others did, and I heard someone shouting. And so, it was a bit faint. You couldn't tell where it was coming from. There was face up there, wind blowing, a bit raining. And the others came up and I said, have you been shouting? I said, no. I said, well, I heard shouting. We could hear the shouting from somewhere up on the face, but we couldn't see anything. We went over to the face and started trying to climb up the rocks, but it was pretty terrible. We just went to where we thought we could hear the shouting. It was wet rock. One climber was better than I was. He climbed further up than I could get, and Ian, we sort of struck our limit. Anyway, he got a bit further up and decided couldn't go any further. So he came back down again and said, look, someone's still alive up there, and that's when they started bringing a lot more people in.
Under such conditions on steep rock, this was obviously turning into a risky rescue.
You know, all this heavy stuff we had to carry up. You know, huge reels of wire and tripods and anchors and all that kind of stuff.
In the meantime, more volunteers had been rushed to Arthur's Pass, including some good climbers, but also others not quite so able.
People were coming in from all over by this time. People were coming in left, right and bloody centre.
Park Ranger John Charles remembers it well.
The Vietnam War was on. And they got the first, I think it was the first detachment that was going to go to Vietnam. They sent them up to see if they could be anybody use. And they put them in the public shelter up here. And the weather at this time was bloody terrible. I mean, it was blowing down the bloody main street and there was bloody grail and bloody, you know, it was absolute shit. And so these poor buggers arrived with their newly issued cotton bloody camo gear, right? And those black high jungle bloody boots to stop the snakes biting their legs. And the poor buggers, I mean, everybody was just bloody frozen because it was just shocking bloody weather, even for Arthur's Pass. It was just so bloody cold. On the Thursday, I got given this group and we had packs full of bloody tents and food and first aid gear and sleeping bags. Like you had your putties on making your way through that track of film bloody scrub up there with this stuff. All we had to do was take it up and drop it off in a big sort of supply dump.
How many people were involved in taking supplies up and setting up?
Well, there must have been about 10 in a big long line.
And how did the army boys getting on, having been prepared to go to Vietnam?
Yeah, well, you know, that was something quite bloody new to them. And of course, you know, the main thing was they didn't have the gear. I mean, they did it, but everybody was wet and bloody cold, you know.
18-year-old John Wilson was among the first party to establish camp, along with a number of seasoned climbers. Some of the best in New Zealand, including Norm Hardy and John Harrison. Others included Ian Gardner, John Wilson and Peter Squires, who first heard the voices up the mountain.
And so, you know, it was a bit faint. You couldn't tell where it was coming from. There was face up there, wind blowing, a bit raining. And the others came up and I said to them, "You've been shouting?" I said, "No." And I said, "Well, I heard shouting."
You have already heard from historian and author John Wilson. He picks up the story.
They decided to establish this camp on the slide as a support camp really for the people who were up on the top ridge, because they had an idea that the missing boys were not too far down the face. The two people in the tent with me on the slide were Norman Hardy and John Harrison. I mean, they're two of the great names of New Zealand mountaineering of that era. We were camped on snow. We were well above the snow line here. Jeff Harrow, who's another very good climber, and he was also in the evening of the Thursday, was at the slide camp. And he said, "Absolutely not, I'm not staying here because I think there's avalanche danger. And I've got a wife and kids at home and I'm not staying the night here. I'll come back up first thing in the morning." So he actually left the camp.
There were now 3 tents pitched at the support camp.
It was a risk, but no one thought it was a serious risk spending the night there.
For the sake of clarity, and because it becomes important later on, the first tent contained Peter Squires and Ian Gardner. The second tent, Nick von Tunzelman, Willie Uber, Hans Bonney and Roy Yates. The third tent, higher up the slope, had John Wilson, John Harrison and Norm Hardy. Norm Hardy was part of the team that successfully climbed the third highest mountain in the world, Mount Kanchenjunga in the Himalayas, at their first attempt. A stunning result. And John Harrison had an outstanding climbing record in the New Zealand Alps, Antarctica and the Himalayas. All had volunteered for this search and rescue and could hardly have been a stronger or more experienced team. And so it was to prove on the night of the 23rd of June, 1966.
Peter and I were in the tent. We had a meal.
This is Ian Gardner, who is sleeping in tent number 1 with Peter Squires.
And then went to sleep probably a bit before 9. 9:15, there was a whoosh. And I sat up and touched my head on solid. I said, we've been avalanche, Pete. He said, yep. Peter was right onto it, like, you know, let's cut the tent, get out, and then look for the other tents. And Peter said, I'll tell you what, I'll get a tin opener from one of the ration pack and we'll cut the end of the tent on the downhill side.
So they cut open the tent, and as Peter dug his way to the surface, pushed the snow back down into the tent.
And he said, I'll tunnel up and you pack the snow.
All 3 tents were buried by the avalanche. John Wilson, the 23-year-old in tent number 3, recalls his experience.
There's just suddenly this whooshing sound, and suddenly that the front of the tent had simply collapsed onto our faces. Norman and I were both lying on our backs, but John was lying on his side facing the tent, so that when the tent collapsed under the weight of the snow, Norman and I had this very small sort of pocket of air, tiny pocket of air really, just above our faces. So then, but John was facing the tent, and I'm almost sure what happened is that the avalanche just pushed the fabric of the tent hard against his face.
In tent number 1, Ian Gardner and Peter Squires were struggling to get out.
Looking back, I would say we had at least 1.5 to 2 metres of snow. We just had enough space to not quite sit up properly, but just to crawl and get turned round. I said, let's just get our torches, put our boots on, get dressed.
Ian and Peter struggled out into the night.
So when we got out, got over to the remains of the other tent. Well, I think we could see where it was, the lower one, from a bit of the pole sticking out. So anyway, we managed to dig down to the bottom end of that, and then we realised the tent had collapsed. And we got another tin and cut the end out of the tent and pulled those for our. Hans Bonney was one. Roy Yates was another one. Nick von Tunnelman. I can't remember who the 4th person was.
Pete spotted where the other tent was because one of the other guys got a torch on.
This is tent number 2, where the party of 4 were trapped and not in great shape, as Peter Squires recalls.
The 4 we'd pulled out were pretty groggy, been sort of starved of oxygen for a while. Hans Bonney was the strongest, but the other 3, all they could do was sort of sit around and keep themselves warm.
They just couldn't sit up at all. They were struggling to do that. So we made them comfortable, and then we got stuck into getting the other tent.
In tent number 3, where John Wilson, Norm Hardy and John Harrison were trapped, things were not going as well.
We were both conscious for some time, and I can remember also that Norman said, rip the tent, because he knew there's air in the snow. And so we did rip the tent, so that must have probably a little bit more air seeped in. But we were under there long enough that we lost consciousness. I remember feeling quite calm and collected, but I do remember that at the very last minute, just before I lost consciousness, I did let out a huge scream, yeah.
There are not many light moments in this story. But just sometimes, even in the grimmest of circumstances, there can be moments that are just bizarre.
The other thing that's quite funny is that at that point I was flatting in Christchurch, and I remember one of my last thoughts was, oh no, they're going to find out I'm gay.
Those were the times.
Yeah, those were the times.
At the time, the 1960s, being gay and acknowledging it was a very no-no thing. With the others still recovering and unable to help, Ian and Peter went up to the 3rd tent, which was placed higher up the slope, to find it deeply buried.
So Ian and I dug down just with our hands, and then I was standing on the bottom of the trench and I could feel the ground going like that. It was Norman Hardy kicking me. He could feel my feet on top of his. I think, oh, they're still alive. We couldn't dig the tent out, but we managed to open another tin lid and cut enough of the tent out so that we could pull them out feet first, just slide them out. Norman was facing in that way and John was facing, so they were facing each other, but John Harrison was facing the out way. And Norman said he'd heard John saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. That was obviously very early.
Ian Gardner.
First one out would have been John Wilson, followed by Norm Hardy, and they were running out of air at that stage. And then we John Harrison out. Peter and I had turns at mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and we did that for probably 15 to 20 minutes without success.
John Harrison was dead. The first and only search and rescue volunteer to be killed in the line of duty. John Wilson eventually came to as he was being rescued.
When Pete and Ian finally broke through to our tent, it was the air coming in that revived me immediately. And I remember being pulled by my feet up the tunnel that they dug. But I do remember thinking, gee, we were buried quite deeply. Could be pulling us up this tunnel for absolute ages. But I remember just sitting there. It was a day and age when people sort of didn't think about traumatic stress and all that.
By now, about 45 minutes had passed since the avalanche had buried the 3 tents.
Then we decided we needed to go out and raise the alarms.
And remember, this is in the middle of the night, in a snowstorm, and after surviving an avalanche that had killed their friend. And even then, the dangers were not over.
It was agreed that Peter and I would walk out, raise the alarm. Hans would look after the survivors. So Peter and I set out, let's see, it would have been probably 10:30. We were in knee to waist deep snow all the way.
And every time you come around through a corner in the creek, the wind would really howl at you and you thought, shit, there's another bloody avalanche coming down. Because all those bluffs under Philistine, Rolleston Ridge, very steep. So we thought there's a fair odd chance we might not make it. But we did, we got out of the avalanche zone.
It took us 5 hours.
Walked down to the road, we thought we'd be able to hitchhike from there. And of course the road was closed because of snow. So we had to walk away, I think we got in at 4 o'clock in the morning or something to the headquarters.
The weather turned out fine the next day, but the search was called off for the missing climbers on the face. They were presumed dead, and the remaining effort went into getting the rescuers safely back to Arthur's Pass and retrieving John Harrison's body. Some months later, after the winter snows had melted, Ranger John Charles and his boss went up to the Otira Valley to retrieve equipment left behind at the support camp.
Croft and I went up there and the snow had virtually all gone. We climbed up to where the bloody camp was and we started getting all the stuff and bloody putting in our packs and bringing out radios and all this crap that, you know, primuses and stuff like that. And I remember we were having bloody lunch and, you know, both sitting lying back with bloody binoculars, bloody scanning the bloody face because we thought there's got to be something up there somewhere, you know. And I remember I suddenly looked into this gully and I thought, there's a fucking rope. I could just make out this bloody rope coming down the bloody rock, right? I'm about halfway up there, Otira face. And so I said to Croft, and we looked and looked and looked, and then you could see this bloody black thing hang on the bloody rope and against this bloody ledge. So we realised that was someone, was something.
Later in the year, Peter Squires was able to follow up on this sighting.
We came in December later that year. The Air Force had just got the Iroquois helicopters and they decided they could fly us in to have a look. So they landed below the Otira face and somebody managed to climb up and find the 2 dead bodies, put them into a sack and just throw them over the side. And they slid down and landed in a shrund between the snowfield and the rock. And we were down there, we managed to pull them out and drag them back down to the helicopter. That was 2 bodies, and the other 2 were still missing.
The complete story of the missing climbers started to emerge.
And a year later, a friend of mine, Bill Kennedy, and some others were doing an Arthur's Pass to Mount Cook tramping trip. For some reason, they decided to go up over Mount Rolleston. Got a bit lost going up the rock face and came across the other 2 bodies. And it looks like they got down to the low peak, they were trying to get off the low peak, and they came down the wrong ridge, come down and got bluffed. That was the end of them, so very tragic.
So the complete story, it seems, is that one English climber got injured on the face, probably by a falling rock. His companion stayed with him while the two Kiwis climbed to the top and went for help. But in the blizzard conditions, lost their way down and died from exposure. Each of the four men that died hadn't even reached their 21st birthdays. Bruce Ferguson of Christchurch, Colin Robertson of Invercargill, Michael Harper and Geoffrey Wilby from the UK.
There was criticism that the boys had tried to do something they was beyond them, and which was absolutely not true. And they'd set out on the Sunday in perfectly good weather, and there'd been very little snow yet, so the face was perfectly climbable. So I think it was just miscalculation, not allowing for the fact that someone might get hurt on the climb. Yeah.
We have not talked much about John Harrison, the only search and rescue volunteer ever to be killed on a rescue. I knew John's reputation as a top climber, but I wanted to know more about John Harrison, the person. So I visited his widow, Annie, in Christchurch at her rather lovely retirement apartment.
It's a pretty grand, dandy
You
show.
managed to fill it up, though.
Dandy show, John on the top of Mount Erebus. And I don't know where the rest of those photos went.
Every room had reminders of John, either photos, he was a school photographer, or paintings. He was also a very good artist.
Are they like, they're not etchings, they're black and white?
Yes, there's another one here, a full-sized one in Namche Bazaar.
Ah, right.
And he would sit there. You couldn't tell what he was doing because he was left-handed. He would have a box there with the drawings on it.
I asked Annie a little about John and her life with him.
I was about 21 and he was about 27. Very, very quiet, uneffacing. He'd grown up in an orphanage, shy, really shy.
But I can see that picture there, very good looking.
Very good looking, but he was very understated. The good lookingness was there, but he was always holding back. I'd been out with him once or twice and he said, "Oh, I'm going to marry you." And I laughed and said, "What? You're joking. You're making up stories." He wasn't in any doubt. I was gobsmacked. I wasn't the pretty girl and I hadn't won the prizes and I wasn't anything but a backcountry kid in town, really. Sure, I'd had an education, but that didn't prove anything. But his attitude towards it was not in doubt.
Annie and John did marry after a very short courtship and had 2 children. John continued to climb at the highest level in the New Zealand Alps, Antarctica and the Himalaya, where he famously helped in the dramatic rescue of Ed Hillary and Peter Mulgrew on Makalu in 1955, the 5th highest peak in the world.
He was really wrecked when he got back. Absolutely done. Got Peter Mulgrew off the top of the mountain. Peter lost his legs. Wally Remains lost his fingers. But none of them died. He didn't ever say how hard it was. He said, "Oh, the Sherpas were marvellous." And I thought, I couldn't bear to talk about it. It was so awful. But that was the man.
At the time, he was one of the top mountaineers in New Zealand. How did you take that on board, that his passion? Quite a high chance of an accident happening.
Never occurred to me. I thought he was absolutely immortal. I didn't. It wasn't something I would have ever said to him or ever even really thought like that about it. That was what he did. That was what made him who he was. And for a kid that had been brought up in an orphanage, to find a passion that turned him into a hero, for me, that was the measure of the man, really.
At the time of the accident, John was working as a graphic artist in Christchurch. I asked Annie about the day news of the missing climbers on the Otira face arrived.
Call came through that 2 boys that he knew, and he'd just been talking to them, had gone up to Rolleston. 2 other boys turned up and they all went up Rolleston. He and I and 2 children went and sat on the Port Hills over there. He was distracted. Whether he synchronised with them or whether he had antennae, I don't know. But he was anxious for something. Now, that might be 6th sense. He knew those 2 boys. He said they were really good boys. He was so frightened for them. He had work to do. He couldn't afford to be away. He said, I have to go. He said, I know I haven't got time. I have to go.
That would be the last time Annie saw her husband, on his way to rescue others.
I was at home with my children, sewing things, and I'd had some curtains to make for a local charity place. And I'd made them, and they were all neat and tidy there. And when the police came at 4 in the morning, everything was sitting there. They came in and I don't remember whether we actually sat down. They told me what had happened. And they said, we can't leave you with this until you get somebody to come. So I rang up my sister and said, could her husband come round? So he came round, and it sort of moved on from there. You look back on it and think, how did I handle that? I think I was a high country kid who took it on what happens in the high country. You have to keep going, sort of thing. I think that's how it was. I didn't dissolve into a collapsed heap of, oh my God, how can I survive? It was like, well, you're a survivor, now get on with it. You've got 2 kids there, go pull yourself together.
In 2016, 50 years after John Harrison's death, at the request of Annie, John Wilson, who had been in the same tent as her husband but survived, wrote a book about his life, Joy of the Mountains, A Climber's Life, 1932 to 1966. And she also erected a memorial to John up at Arthur's Pass, which I visited just as dusk fell with John Wilson, and is a fitting end for this story.
It's close to the chapel, it's a few metres away. The monument itself is just a cairn of stones, and at the very top is a rather large chunk of rock, and on the very top of that rock, bronze cast of one of John Harrison's boots, made for Annie by Sam Mann, the sculptor, and also on the plaque recording the five names are lines from New Zealand poet A.R.D. Fairbairn.
It's got remembering John Harrison, Bruce Ferguson, Geoffrey Wilby, Colin Robertson, Michael Harper, and underneath that it says Lost on Mount Rolleston, June 1966. Would you mind reading those for me, John?
Oh, they're wonderful. I've known them by heart for years.
Oh.
Land of mountains and running water, rocks and flowers, and the leafy evergreen. O natal earth, the atoms of your children are bonded to you forever.
Next time. Deep underground, a caving accident pushes rescuers to their limit, with no guarantee of success.
And then there was this a little bit of a clatter of rocks and just a staccato screaming, and I recognised that it was Michael's voice. So we need 2 people to go out. That leaves 1 person with Michael. And if Michael's dying, that poor person has got to cope with that.
And actually, in the group of 5 that went down, I was the only person who knew the way.
We're 2 hours from the entrance if we travel fast.
And then the next thing I remember was lying across the legs of my friend Bruce.
That's coming up next time on Search and Rescue NZ. And thanks for listening. A special thanks to the Land Search and Rescue men and women who generously shared their experiences. Thanks to the producers of the series, Phil Vine, Justine Murray and Justin Gregory. Production coordinator, Brianna Juritich-Gregg. Executive audio editor, Tim Watkin. Thanks to Ben Pearce, the engineer for this episode. Find and follow Search and Rescue NZ on your favourite podcast app or at rnz.co.nz/podcasts.